Good afternoon, or should I say evening. It's great to see everyone still here. I thank the organizers of this event. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about what I think is such an important issue, educating children with disabilities. If you've had a chance to look at my paper, which I know a few of you have, because you've had nice things to say, so thank you. I'm going to try to follow that, but I also feel like I typically go a bit off script. Just a forewarning that that's my usual ammo, is to just kind of go off of what I originally thought I was going to say and go with a bunch of other things. Woo. Okay. Feel like a superstar now. Okay, so children with disabilities throughout the world are often marginalized and excluded from mainstream societies. In many countries, we see children with disabilities put in institutions and removed from society and their communities for their entire lives. In other countries, children with disabilities are forced to attend separate schools and do not go to school with their peers. Just want to kind of jump in there. This is my first example of where I throw in things from what I heard of everyone today. The right to the arts, song, dance, participation, playing with your friends. That is stripped away when a child is placed either in an institution or forced to go to a separate school that's not in their community with the other kids that they may grow up with. The result of failure to provide education for children with disabilities has led to a very low rate of employment for persons with disabilities throughout the world and a disproportionately high rate of poverty. In 2011, the World Report on Disability noted that there's some progress that has been made, but still we're seeing that education, I think it's around 3% of girls with disabilities throughout the world are receiving, going up through secondary education. Still very low rates, which is leading to really high unemployment rates. For example, a number people are often shocked by is when I say in the United States, persons who are blind, 75% unemployment. Persons who are deaf, 90% unemployment. This is because they're not receiving appropriate education and the tools that they need to succeed in the employment market. So the issue with going off script is that I have to figure out where I am in the script, so I apologize, that may happen a few times. So what I'm going to address today is just generally the right to education and international human rights law. And then I'm going to go over what I think the convention adds to this dialogue and the idea of inclusive education, which is, I think, just awesome. It's the best thing in human rights ever. Then I will go through the benefits of inclusive education, again, because it's awesome, and go over some recommendations as to what state parties can do to transition from their current situations into inclusive systems. So to start off, the right to education has long been established in international human rights law. The Universal Declaration recognized the right, and that was reaffirmed in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's in the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and of course, the CRC. So what does the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, add to this dialogue? Well, for the first time, we've been introduced to the idea of inclusive education. The idea that kids with disabilities cannot be, are allowed to be educated with their peers in the general education system. Okay, I'm just finding where I am. So what is inclusive education? One important So the idea that the right of persons with disabilities to receive the support required within the general education system to facilitate their effective education. What does that mean? Earlier today we heard about reasonable accommodations, necessary and appropriate modifications. Sorry about that. Am I standing too close? Okay, everyone's listening. That's good to hear you laugh. Modifications or adjustments where needed in certain situations. So one step that's very important in terms of inclusive education is the idea of reasonable accommodations so that children and adult learners as well, but in this case I'm talking about children, so we'll keep going with that idea, so that children can be educated in the general education system. Examples of reasonable accommodations may include extended time on tests, large print or braille materials, a sign language interpreter, and there's just many other, having a class on the first floor of a building instead of the second floor of a building, rearranging the seating, perhaps modifying the curriculum a little bit. So those are just a few of the many examples of reasonable accommodations for children with disabilities to be able to participate in general education. One thing, going outside of just the convention text and thinking about what is inclusive education, and so the idea of children participating in general education, we've seen a lot of countries move or attempt to move towards taking children out of special schools, segregated schools. So for example, you'll hear of schools for the blind, or schools for the deaf, or schools just for children with disabilities. And in an attempt to make their education system inclusive, they'll move those children into a general education school. However, we're seeing problems with when they do that, not necessarily providing accommodations for the child to effectively learn or go from grade to grade. So the idea of inclusion is not just placing a child in a classroom or in a school with their peers, but it's placing a child in the classroom or the school with the appropriate supports and accommodations they need to succeed and learn, and to really benefit from education. Some of the benefits of inclusive education, so beyond just the legal framework and the human rights law that we've kind of just gone over, is we've seen that communities benefit, societies benefit actually at a real high level. When kids with disabilities are going to school with their peers, societies and communities are becoming more aware, attitudes are changing about disability. In countries where you see kids with disabilities in school with other children, people as they get older, they don't see the difference. Disability is not a different or an other. It raises the level of awareness. Another benefit is families benefit. In situations or countries where you see children being removed and placed in institutions or sent to separate schools that are far away, families either are not with their child at all or are forced to pay extraordinary fees for transportation to send their child to schools that are not in the community. So here, inclusive education often benefits families. It gives them the opportunity to raise their child in the home and to hopefully have transportation that is accessible and convenient to schools that are located in a closer proximity than we often see the special schools. Another thing is just the benefit of inclusive education and children's learning in general is that one thing that is really emphasized is the different ways of teaching. That teachers no longer just sit up and lecture, which I'm doing right now, but get into it. Use art, use dance, use PowerPoint. Sorry, I keep yelling. Just really, people learn in different ways, whether you have a disability or you don't have a disability, and kids benefit from the different ways that inclusive education is really making teachers teach. That it's no longer just one way of teaching, but it's focusing on really getting learners to acquire information in the various ways. And that's a very important benefit. I also, in addition to going off notes, I often write random notes to myself that I then wonder what I meant. For example, art. I think that probably goes along with what I was just saying. So we talked about just briefly some of the benefits. We talked about the idea of reasonable accommodation, what an inclusive education or what an inclusive school is. And the next big question and thing I'd like to address is a transition to inclusive education. It's one thing for me to kind of sit on an ivory tower and talk about what these concepts are. It's another thing in reality to try to figure out how to move from an education system that may completely segregate children or provide no education for children with disabilities to an inclusive education system. So one of the first steps is to review and amend current legislation. So does your country's education law include provisions for children with disabilities? If not, do you need to adopt new legislation, or does your country elect to amend its current education legislation? You see different models in different countries. For example, in my country, the United States, we have separate legislation for what we call special education. But there are many countries, actually many of the countries I've worked in, that typically amend their legislation, their general education law, to include provisions for children with disabilities in school. In that vein, another very important step for governments and civil society to take and develop, both as you're thinking about legislation and developing education policy and implementing such policies, is to devise a timetable. Basically for everything I'm about to talk about, I think we tend to get very excited and think, oh, this will happen, we can do this in 1 year. I don't think that's very realistic, and often, just like anything in life, I think when you don't necessarily meet your own measurements, that you kind of lose the enthusiasm. So I think it's very important that at the beginning, in transitioning to inclusive education, devise a realistic timetable, think about all of the different steps, whether it's removing physical barriers, training the community to start addressing attitudinal barriers. How are you going to monitor and evaluate progress? So that timetable is an important first step to setting the realistic picture of moving towards this inclusive education system. Another step that we see is very successful and important is to strategize as to how to train teachers and school staff. This is one thing that the CRPD calls for, is teacher training. But I think for governments to really think this through, a lot of countries have centralized education systems where they have a curriculum for teachers, and in that curriculum, it's addressing how are we going to teach teachers how to teach in inclusive classrooms. In my country, the United States, we do not have a centralized education system, so each university has its own curriculum. We're really working to try to get them to not think of education for some teachers, then special education degrees is a totally different thing, trying to blend so that all teachers are learning how to work with students with disabilities and provide accommodations. The other big issue is, okay, so it's one thing to address the teacher curriculum, but what about teachers that have been out and currently are teaching? Well, I think thinking through continuing teacher education programs, training programs, having current teachers that do work with students with disabilities really involved in kind of the retraining. But In a case out of Europe a few years ago, it was 2008 now, Mental Disability Advocacy Center v. Bulgaria, the Committee on Economic and Social Rights found that teachers were absolutely inadequately trained. They did not know how to work with children with disabilities. And one of the recommendations that Mental Disability Advocacy Center, which I'll call MDAC from here out, made is that teacher training. And in that situation, they recommended that a certain amount of teachers be trained to work with students with disabilities. I believe we have to go further than that. We have to ensure that everybody, every teacher that's right now being educated to become a teacher, I think is the easiest target to go after. But I also think that people that have been teachers for 25 years now should be receiving training. You know, if we're going to make this fully inclusive and we're going to make that transition, I think it's really important that all teachers are prepared to work with students with disabilities and understand what reasonable accommodations are. And the next important, I'm so sorry, I get excited. This is why I talk about the timetable, people being excited. I'm the best example. Is another important, really important, and I know everything I've been saying is really important, but I'll put a really important in front of this one, is data. We don't know enough just generally about disability in many countries, and there's major gaps in the data collection methods, and that can be extended even further to children with disabilities. In certain countries where there's stigma, there's stereotyping, parents may hide their children with disabilities, so regional school officials are not even aware of where children are or are not located with disabilities. I know in many situations the number of children in institutions, orphanages, segregated schools, just there's not very good information about the numbers, so it's hard to really concretely tell how many kids with disabilities are being missed. And so therefore it makes it difficult to transition all of those kids and ensure that they're all being placed in the general education school. That goes to another very important point on monitoring and evaluating the transition. So we can talk and we create the timetable. We're working on the reviewing and amending legislation, teacher training, but as in kind of everything we do in life now, it seems like you really need to be developing indicators and tracking your progress and seeing if you are meeting targets. You know, and that way it's partially through the process, so maybe halfway into the timetable you do a midterm evaluation as to where your country's system is in the transition, what can be improved, and what steps need to be changed. Is the data, the current data and statistics plan that you're implementing, is that working, or have you noticed that it's not really helping to identify the children with disabilities that are outside of the school system? So I think that's just another very important, again there's important, area that governments need to consider as they transition from the current education systems over to inclusive education. Another thing that I mentioned in my paper is governments working with civil society and really helping to get civic participation with parental groups. In many countries, parents are not at all aware of their children's rights, and maybe that is the reason that they're not sending their child to school, or in instances where they are and they have their child in school, their child is not receiving any accommodations, that they're not actually learning anything. They may be just being placed in the classroom in the corner, the teacher's not speaking with them, and where parents are not aware and also their child is not aware of their rights, that's a real issue. And so one thing that a lot of parents have provided feedback on is that when they are able to meet other parents and their children can meet other children and they can share knowledge, they can learn more about what their rights are, how to advocate for such rights, that really helps push this transition. And at the end of the day, it really is parents that are holding schools and school administrators accountable until children get older, and then both the parent and the child are the ones that are really barking down the tree and making sure that their rights are being implemented. So in addition to all of this, I know the big question I get is, well, how do you afford to do all of that? There's been a few people today who have addressed budget allocations. This is a very important thing, that you can't just say all of this and not think of the budget implications that are behind either making modifications, physical modifications to the school, providing more trainings to current teachers, working through the data and statistics. It's important that as this is all happening, really thinking through budgetary implications, and also how reasonable accommodations and the plan that you choose to use to provide reasonable accommodations is going to be budgeted for. And there's very different strategies for that. Now that I've jumped all the way around, I'm just finding where and one of the last things that I want to address, and I sort of intentionally put this last just because I think in ways it's obvious, but sometimes it's not obvious until, you know, at the end where it's like, why did she not mention this first? But so we're reviewing and we're amending legislation, and we're devising a timetable that's realistic, starting to develop data and statistics, gathering information about the number of children with disabilities out there, monitoring and evaluating progress, all of the things that I've listed before. But really one of the most important things for any of this to all go together is we have to remove the current barriers, whether they're physical, attitudinal, informational, communication, and I think that's the biggest challenge, is the attitudinal barriers. We think of the physical barriers, or we can list out all the informational barriers, but currently a lot of countries have a mindset towards education that it is to test and see who does best on the test in a very standardized form, and to really progress from grade to grade just based on that. And not looking at the holistic approach of teaching and what education is from a social perspective, from an educational perspective, that people learn in different ways. So I think just tying it all together, that those barriers both need to be thought about at the beginning, and as I said, I'm hoping right now it's like, why did she not mention that at the beginning? Just to be provocative is really my answer. But now at the end, right now, thinking through, hearing everything that I've just mentioned, what are all of the barriers? And how can we ensure that those are all removed? So in conclusion, there's a lot of steps that need to be taken, a lot of information that needs to be reviewed and considered, awareness raising that needs to happen, government, civil society, national human rights institutions, disabled people's organizations, children with disabilities, teachers, all need to be involved in this process. And I think just thinking about human rights at a broad scale, the idea that human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated, for me the right to education is one of the greatest examples of that. Because, you know, I spoke at the beginning of, if you don't have the right to education, you may not be able to have a good job or an adequate standard of living. But you may not feel informed to participate in your political life. You may not understand your judicial system. In terms of freedom of opinion and expression, I could go on and on and on about how important the right to education is, and the reason that I think inclusive education is such a great concept that we really need to work to transition our countries into, and our societies and our education systems. So, thank you.